All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It really means a lot. Hello and welcome. I'm happy to see some familiar faces. Hi, Max. And some new faces out in the group. My name is Lucy Hinton. I'm a product designer at Foundry. I also have the pleasure of being the treasurer for the User Experience Professionals Association of Minnesota. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to bug me at the end of this about that. I'll let you introduce.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Geri Huibregtse, and I am the COO at a company called Foundry. We're a design agency that develops software locally, and I have a background in working with teams to build software, and also I worked within a local startup here, like building a product team and working on the kind of that side of things. So Lucy and I are hoping to bring our shared perspectives about doing some user research and ways to kind of get that started.
Yeah, so today is kind of a collection of maybe our experiences as well as conversations that we've had. So we definitely want to leave time at the end for more conversation. We all grow as a community when we get to share ideas and share perspectives, share experiences. So we just kind of wanted to present today what we've learned so far and hoping to learn more today as well. But before we dig into it, just wanted to kind of take a second to talk about what do we mean by user feedback. If you had been in the room before this session, there was a great session about Kano analysis, definitely a form of user research, but there are different kinds. So there's generative research, which can be exploratory discovery research. There can be usability testing, so something on an existing product or something that's about to go to market. We have surveys, interviews, and focus groups, and there's a ton of other methods.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I wanted to cover is sometimes this can be called a voice of customer, like you're gathering the voice of customer. So it's like just methods by which you would use to gather that information. And it can be anything. Like when we describe, sometimes I think user research can sound very serious, and it's like we can really do a lot of very quick things to gather information that can be used. So that is also what we're going to talk about a little bit later.
So today we have some key ideas we're going to cover. The first is maybe the biggest one. Why should you care about user feedback or research? I think that at times, even from an agency perspective, you can hear back from clients a lot of reasons why not to, right? They want to move fast. They don't have the time. They don't have the budget. They already know what their users want because, well, they already have personas, right? Or they'll launch it and then do a fast follow and fix it. So we're hoping today to discuss maybe some of the reasons why we care and why we think you should care, and some maybe reasons that you can help convince other people to care. Then we'll talk about the idea that everyone counts. Cross-functional teams can really bring a holistic view to your product and understanding of your products and users. So we kind of want to dig into what we've experienced by bringing in other insights from other people, different business units, different people on your team. Then we want to talk about the plan, right? Research protocols can get a reputation for being complicated and expensive, but there are some core information that's universal to all different types of research and gathering user feedback. So we'll kind of share our approach with that. And then don't let user feedback go to waste, right? User feedback isn't valuable to your team or your business if you don't have buy-in from stakeholders, from other members of your organization. So we want to maybe outline some steps that you can take to make it be more memorable and meaningful and impactful to people within your team and your organization. And finally, we'll talk about making your methods repeatable. It's something that maybe shouldn't just happen once, and it doesn't just happen one time in a product's life cycle. So we want to talk about different places where it could be valuable, and then getting through that first time that can be really difficult.
All right. So now we're going to talk about why should we care? Number one, we're not the users. So I think we always try to pretend like, oh, we can do it. We're just like them. And that the truth is we're not. We all have our blind spots and biases and all of that. And it's really, really, really important to hear from the people that are using the things that we're building.
I would hop in on that one and
Yeah.
say too, I know when I look at a product that I've worked on, I know how many hours it took to do that. And so keeping in mind our bias can also be about the effort behind it, which is, I mean, it means a lot. This is our work, this is what we care about, but then we have a bias about cutting a button that we maybe spent a lot of time figuring out how to make it work.
For sure. Also, the loudest voices don't always equal the best feedback. And I think we're all guilty of being, in a room where people are giving feedback and the loudest person is like, well, this is what I think and blah, blah, blah. So it's hard to, kind of focus that and then also to really suss out the feedback that you need. One of the things is, I guess I had worked on a team where we were getting a ton of feedback, like very, very useful feedback about, it was an internal team. They were working on a really important part of the product, they were using the product. They were like a customer success team, right? And they were saying like, this isn't working for me. This makes my job slow. This does this. But the long-term business plan at the higher level was to automate much of that work. So we weren't going to be building software to fix that job. So it's a case of like having to marry both the feedback that's coming in and the people that are using it, and then also understanding where the business is going. So it's super important. So knowing that why is really essential to really building a path that matters. So I think that's it.
I think I'd talk a little bit too about context and filters.
Oh, yeah.
When you're gathering feedback, anecdotes can be very, very persuasive, right? You've got that perfect customer quote that encompasses everything you've been trying to say. But the fact of the matter it could be an outlier, right? That is the problem with anecdotes. So by continuing to gather user feedback, by continuing to gather information, you can start to see patterns and you can start to identify what's an outlier and what isn't and what matters. So keeping a broad perspective can help you zoom in and figure out what actually makes a big impact as opposed to that one perfect quote that maybe came from one loud voice. Mm-hmm. And also it does help you with your roadmap, right?
Yeah.
It helps you define that mix of business and what's meaningful to the people you're making it for.
Mm-hmm. All right. So one thing that we wanted to make sure is to talk about who is involved in user research, and really everyone on the team matters and everyone counts. So making sure that you're bringing people from different parts of a cross-functional team into some user research is super important. If you cannot bring your software engineer into a user feedback session because of time and money and all of the things that we work under, make sure to figure out a way to give them that information, deliver it, present it, whatever, because understanding what the users are doing is super important to making good decisions in building software. So it helps with empathy. It is in addition to a persona that you might have up on the wall that describes what your users do and who they are and what they care about. But having that reinforcement is super important. So even if there's some like contextual inquiry that you're going on, like you're gonna go jump in a car with someone who's gonna go use an app on their dash, like bring someone else with so that they get to see what's happening as well.
I think that it can be a classic case of show, don't tell too, right? If you're telling someone about the research that you did, as opposed to maybe bringing them into the synthesis and bringing them in to see the actual human connection, it's kind of like those visual studies that people will immediately look at a face before anything else when they're looking at say, an advertisement or something, people are drawn to each other. So if you can have that human connection, you can get buy-in from your team, from your executives, from the people who have to make decisions. And again, having the user voice be the driving force behind that, right? When you're building products and services, there's a lot of decision-making to be done. Teams can experience decision-making fatigue. There can be points of contention between business units that maybe they have strong opinions about, marketing design could disagree on a lot of patterns. But having that user voice can also come and be that tiebreaker and also help drive those decisions so your team doesn't experience as much fatigue, as goes into building a product.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So now we're going to tell you a little bit about how it's done. And Lucy has an amazing example to explain it.
So I'm going to combine my two favorite things, which is user research, and then who here has hosted a dinner party before or had people over to your house, right? I think there's a lot of similarities there. There's the who, what, why, and how that you need to focus on to have successful user research as well as a successful Thanksgiving meal. So one of the things that you want to start with is who is coming over for dinner and why are they doing it? So is it a holiday? Do they expect a turkey on the table? You start to figure out the why. You start to figure out your hypothesis. Why are you asking these questions? What are you trying to figure out? What is the goal for this engagement? And then what are your users trying to achieve? Are they attempting to come to a friend's Thanksgiving so they don't have to have dry turkey again year over year? Try to figure out what the why is behind all of it. Then there's the who. You want to know who's coming over for dinner. You want to know if they have allergies. You want to know if they are monsters who hate cheese. You want to figure out what you're going to, you got to start picking out your recipes, and you want to tailor it to the people who are going to be eating it, right? So you want to start to figure out, do they have familiarity with your product? Have they been to your house before? But then also, what are their preconceived notions of what you are presenting to them? And start to figure out what makes their attendance special. Why are you asking them these questions? And why are you making something for them? Once you have the why and the who figured out, those are your driving forces behind your plan. Then you can move into your what. So these are your tools and your ingredients. What are you going to be testing? Do you need a prototype? Do you have something that's existing? Do you need to create something for them to test? Do you need to go get help to recruit people? Do you have to go to a specialty store to find the ingredients, right? You need to start to figure out where you're going to source all of the things that you need to put it all together. So one of the things that can be very, very valuable is writing down your grocery lists and your equipment needs. And the same thing can be said for how are you going to record your users, or how are you going to record an interview? What are you going to test? And then finally, we've got the how, which is your time frame and your tool usage, right? You want to, if you are going to feed 15 people in your tiny house, what do you need? What's the time frame? What time do you have to start cooking? And in this case, it is how long does it take? How much time do you need to allocate? This is really where you're talking about people and budget here. How many people are you going to have in the room? How much time do you need for each thing? Does your team need extra training? How familiar are you with the tools you're using? So once you get all of that together, then you write it down, and then you start to write the notes about your attempt. You start to record the things that you've done. One of the things that I think can be a mistake oftentimes is spending too much on that first try. So people will spend a lot of time and a lot of money on an expensive test that didn't work out because it was too expensive and it took too long. So the first time you make a souffle, don't spend $50 on cheese, right? You don't want to put too much effort into the first try. This is where you're learning. So keep it light and keep it simple and practice it. And then, so with all of that, you plan for what you know. You document as you go. You write the changes that you make in the margins, so you can go back and you can look at it and say, oh, I had to make these changes. So next time we do it, we know why we made changes, and we know which changes we need to make. And then, learn from your mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes. It happens every single time. So fix it for the next time.
Yeah, I think just to echo what Lucy said, understanding the why, a really big deal. And I think it's implied, but we're also saying, just write this all down. Like, it should not be longer than a page or two, but make sure you have it, because you'll want it the next time. You'll want to know how you did what and where. There's also, like, some things I was scribbling down as Lucy was talking, was just a little bit too about, maybe you don't have to incentivize your friends to come to a dinner party, but you may have to incentivize people to tell you about your product. So it's something that you have to think about, like maybe it's a gift card or some swag, or I don't know what it is, but make sure that you're thinking about that, and then how just the logistics around what it might be like to talk with you and be video recorded, or just listening on a phone call. So there's just certain logistics. I was thinking about, like, when I was coming here and I'm like, where do I go? Where do I park? What door do I go into? All this stuff. These people are not necessarily familiar if you're asking them to come. And we'll talk about some more specific examples as we go, but I just wanted to kind of add that stuff. I can't help it. I'm like a project manager.
Cross-functional team.
That's right. That's right.
So once you have all of this useful, helpful, thoughtful feedback from your users, don't let it go to waste. Raw data is absolutely 100% not your final product, right? That's a spreadsheet that's living somewhere that isn't useful for your teams. You need to get some synthesis. You need to start identifying patterns, and do that with your team. Do that with outside perspectives. Start to convert that feedback into action items. You can do that by starting to see what those patterns are, starting to see what the themes are, and starting to align them with your business goals, right? So if it doesn't work for your company, if it doesn't work for your business, you shouldn't do it, even if that's what your users want. You have to make sure that your business goals, your product goals, and the goals of your users align. And making sure to, if your customers, I think I was using an example, if your customers want a rocket ship and you build paper airplanes, maybe you're aiming for the wrong customers. And so push back on what you've learned too, right? You want to figure out, was it a flaw in the testing that suddenly my customers are asking for rocket ships? Or was it a flaw in our product roadmap? And so starting to figure out what all of that means is how you share it with your team. And maybe it'll work in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Like, if they're, if you're gathering all this feedback and you're finding you have some things that maybe don't apply right now, you can create a parking lot for the future. You can frame it in a way that is thinking about it in a now, next, and later framework. So it may not be now, it may be in the future. And those, even that framework can be tailored to what you think. Could be 3, 6, 9 months. It could be 1, 2, 3 years. So those things really will depend. But the important part is you're capturing it. You're capturing it somewhere. You have that data point. So when the important things bubble up again, you can go to that. Because, the building products and gathering feedback is a huge exercise in many, many times saying no, not yes. So you're having to, back up what you're doing. And when feedback becomes, I was thinking when you were chatting about making it tangible and making it actionable, that's like the feedback loop that has to happen in order to change the minds of people that maybe don't think user research is worth it. So, and I don't know, this is maybe a little bit of a wrap-up point, but I think just knowing that user research is really is important, despite the fact that there are maybe some people that are like, I don't have time for it, I don't have money for it, whatever. It really, really is. And you can do it quickly. And the key is, like, to Lucy's point, do something fast. Talk to 4 people 3 times out of the year and try to, like, get some action steps out of it. So to make it really useful.
It's definitely more expensive to make the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
Or to have to remake it.
Yes.
So if
or to make it and then not use it
Yeah.
because it didn't fit the need. Yeah. So finally, we want to talk about really making things repeatable. So that's kind of where I was speaking to that. So if you can build in a research cycle into how you work, that's the best. Even if it's it's like some really quick, I'm going to bring in 4 people, or I'm going to give calls to 10 users and talk to 4 of them and then incorporate that, just so you're doing that, or maybe some A/B testing. Make it part of just your regular, this is how we work. And then really talk about your needs over time. So this talk is meant to be, how do you get started? But there's definitely a spectrum of things that you can do for user research. So, for example, at a product company, they may put together an entire, like a customer, I'm like blanking on the word, but it's just like a big group of people that you bring in on a regular basis, and it's fairly formal, and you bring them in, you're in a conference room, and you're like gathering feedback, and it's like a big deal for them to participate. So something like that compared to just doing some phone calls is just a really wide spectrum. But as you can imagine, they also have very different costs. So it just kind of can run the gamut. And then I wanted to say that, we talked about writing things down, which seems very simple, but also super important. And then it's like a muscle. So you do it, and then you get better at it, and your team gets better at it, and people get more comfortable. And then it kind of gets better from there. Promise.
It does. That first time is the hardest one, right?
Yes.
So that is what we have prepared. But I think it'd be helpful if we could hear some experiences, maybe if anybody wants to share, or if you have any questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll bring the mic to you so they can record it.
So I work at a company, and actually I coach in our contact center, where we get a lot of customer feedback, which we had built out measures for them to submit through. And I, as a side role, help out on a team that reviews those and then tries to pass those along. And a lot of our essentially our appeal is that it's at no cost, quote unquote. Obviously, once we pass it along, it's like, okay, can you put this in some change you're already doing to the team or department that's working on either a form or the website or a product or whatever. And we've unfortunately had a lot of slowdown this year as we've lost people, and kind of having to build back up from there and trying to start recruiting again to be like, hey, here's more work you can help out with, and kind of touch base with other teams and departments and kind of interconnect. But honestly, one of the main struggles has been making sure we're making the case to other areas as well as our higher-ups to say, hey, we think there's a cost savings here. We think this will reduce our call volume, or we'll reduce, there'll be something positive coming out of this, in the long run. We're addressing this specific complaint or these multitude of complaints that we've been hearing. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when we get multitude of complaints, it's usually the bigger issue that requires more work, more resources to get fixed. And then it's always the harder, like, yeah, it'll be on our roadmap in 2 to 3 years. And it's like, okay, but this is something we've been asking for 2 years already.
Yeah.
And so, trade-offs. But
articulating that ROI is
Yes.
really, really, well, it's hard, one, and
we tried to guesstimate how many calls that we would get on the subject, basically asking for the thing.
Yes.
And then said, okay, the average call time of this call is this length. This number of people probably get it per day. This is the number of hours per year, and just kind of try and make our case that way. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it's like,
Yeah.
we could put this off.
Yes. Yeah, it's a really hard thing because as I guess, when you think about the amount of people it takes to build a new feature,
Yes.
to design it, build it, launch it, all of that, there's like this weighing of resources, and it's not always fun to be on the side of like where a problem might be solved more with people, not software, when you're like, come on. It'd be so much better. Yes. It sounds like you're doing everything, though, truly. Like understanding, quantifying the numbers, how it makes changes, what the ROI is.
I pushed something recently with our higher-ups.
Yeah.
You're like, hey, you can get to another level.
Yes. Yes. You're like fighting the good fight. Yes.
I think a lot of this
Yes.
is advocating for your
Uh-huh.
users. And if you can tie it into retention rates, that can also help put it in a context. One of my all-time favorite quotes, and something I kind of designed by, is people come for the features and stay for the details, right? And they're going to leave if you don't make it accessible, if you make it too difficult to use, and it doesn't really matter if you have a cool new feature if they can't fill out a form.
Yeah.
And if you can find a way to tie those into the other metrics that are being measured, that's always really helpful.
This is just a question on just thoughts or advice on making the data you're gathering usable over time. So rather than having each reach out to customers, be like a discrete report on a discrete question that has no relation to each other, making your experience something you can say, we can actually trend over every 6 months, here's a difference we're seeing, or ways that you can keep your data like alive so that the money and time you put into it doesn't just die the moment you make a decision, but can go back to it in some way.
Thank you for that question. I'm sure Lucy has an opinion. I will give my brief non-designer opinion.
I mean,
and
there
that-
are definitely research repositories that can
Yes.
help you with that. But part of it is also keeping documents accessible to more than just the person who created it. I think keeping information like that, treating it like living information, and treating it like it's something that people can continually go back to and add to and change. And then, of course, keep a log, because you don't want someone going in there deleting all the points they don't like, right, of course. But if you make it accessible to your own team and to other people, if it's just present and easy to access, that can be one way of making sure you go back and reference it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I know that there are softwares, like there are people that Lucy and I know who have built tools to keep user research feedback together. But in my experience, I haven't ever worked with a team that uses one. So I think having a folder and having things in the right place and contextualize it when you're using it and have the other stuff otherwise. And, I also think getting it into a level that's consumable. So like Lucy and I recently worked on a project where we were gathering ideas and feedback from a group, and then she worked to thematically organize them and then identify the high-level themes, right? So it's like, we'll remember those themes. We may not remember the exact data point that went under them, but being able to get it in a just kind of a like consumable level is good. And then, yeah, when you can attach it into a roadmap or into a parking lot that you're going to come back to, I think that's kind of as good as without the tool that does all the fancy stuff.
We do link the synthesis, right? We wrote a report. We had all of our findings and our recommendations, and at the end we have an addendum to the raw data. so you can go back and find it if you need to. It's not so hard to find.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to go all the way over here, and then you're next.
It's kind of a follow-up with what you were just talking about for the raw data and synthesizing it. I think a lot of like product teams, they look at researchers as the experts for drawing those conclusions. You mentioned that you should include the broader team. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, do you include them from the very beginning with all your raw data and you kind of slog through it together? Or is it more like you bring that first draft and then you kind of refine it from there for the themes?
I mean, the way that I've seen it done has been where there's a team who specifically works on like a particular group of a product or like a piece of a product, and the designer who, or like the product designer who also does the research with a product person and the engineer are talking about the kind of why and what we're going after, and then the data is gathered, and then maybe there's some synthesis that goes on together, like a conversation. It isn't like, I don't think there's the slogging together. I think there's just someone who gets to do that by themselves. The joyous job of that.
Well, and I think I should probably see if I am selling these correctly, but I've been a part of some research sprints before, right? That can be very helpful where you have key stakeholders that are decision makers, probably subject matter experts. Maybe you've got an engineer or two, you've got a producer or a product manager, but mostly you have key decision makers. And get them together for a week. Do the Google Ventures design sprint. It works, right? Because you have all of these people create the who, what, why, and how together. And I've had vice presidents of sales or whatever sit there and watch me conduct user interviews. And what that does is it was a week of his time, or her time. Let's say her time in this world. It was a week of her time. And in that time, she watched her idea get tested and thrown in front of users. So they have that buy-in and they are in it for the whole time. But having that ability to test something out without having to fully build it and then go through all of the testing, go through all of the QA, but instead do a lightweight prototype testing was a really fast and easy way to kind of get buy-in from everyone. And that was a really good use of cross-functional teams. Sometimes you can have somebody in there, maybe you do have an engineer. It's a technical problem. Maybe you do have a developer on the call who's sitting and watching you conduct. And if they don't have time for it, also make highlight reels. That's always a really good way of doing that too, is just give them the ability to see the highlights.
Yeah, I can. Did that answer your question? Yes.
Well, now I have so many other questions. Let me go back. Both the presentation before this and this one is really getting at kind of, it seems more like the value or the impact. And then what, in my experience, taking the impact and then also getting together with the engineers and figuring out what is the effort. And that kind of bubbles to the surface, the things that are a little bit easier. If we're talking about features, and so I suppose apples to apples, but for feature development, what is, easier to do, but also has super high, impact. But is that something that you all have anything to add in terms of, figuring out what goes on that roadmap? Everything can't go on the roadmap, So how are you determining the roadmap in terms of when things get
Oof, that's a big task.
I mean, I love Kano.
Full-time job.
They did a great presentation on Kano. It's one of my favorite methods. But determining where you are, I think, in your product's life cycle. If you're ready, if you've nailed the fundamentals of what your users are attempting to accomplish, then yeah, sure, start to try out new features. But I think it's that you want to start with your MVP, and then where do you go from there? Which features do you pick? And I think that's entirely dependent on what works and what doesn't for your users and what their specific goals are.
I was going to say too, depending on the type of the the exercise that I was describing that Lucy and I did, where we were gathering things and then making them thematic, that was much more of a kind of a broad, high-level discussion. But if you're doing some type of very specific user research that is, say you're working on an onboarding flow, and you're going to talk with the people that are going to use it, and you're gathering that feedback, then if you've identified why you're doing the research, then that's where it goes back to. And then I think what Lucy said, as far as the Kano model, or just a prioritization exercise where you're evaluating effort versus value too. And those work really well when you can define the value that they actually will bring, which is also the hard stuff. So, does that answer your question? I know it's a big question. We can talk afterwards. Yeah.
I like the broad approach because then the details are in the research, right? So if you take a broad approach, you can kind of get the answers by asking people too, a little bit, sometimes.
One of the,
How are we on time?
I'm not sure. Are we good?
We've got time, 7 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. One of the other things I was going to say that you reminded me of with your question is that, ideas and feedback and backlogs, sometimes we just get rid of them and start over. Like, that happens because we live in a world that is moving very quickly, and so is the technology. And if it's incredibly important, it will pop up again. So, and that is again something that's hard for people. I have more recently been thinking about how product is kind of counterculture, because we really do have to say no a lot, and people don't like that. It's not the best. You're not usually delivering the most amazing news. So.
Yeah, it's the same quote. If people, what was the Ford quote? Not that you want to bring him in too much into the real world now, but
Yeah.
if you'd ask people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, you do.
We're being recorded.
Oh no. So my question is, how do you decide who you're gonna ask, who you're gonna bring in, who your users are gonna be, and how many you're gonna use?
That's a great question. Thanks, Robert. It depends on where you are in the product life cycle. If you need a broader perspective, if you're doing a survey, you can bring in more. If maybe you're doing an initial testing on a prototype, it can be less. So I think what Geri shared earlier, you can start to identify a pattern after 3 to 5 data points. So if you're looking for lightweight user feedback, or you're starting to do some generative research, you're starting to do some discovery, you can know that you can bring in 3 to 5 people, and you're probably going to recognize a pattern pretty quickly. If you're doing bug testing, probably the same thing, right? As soon as people get their hands on something, they are going to show you everything that you accidentally did incorrectly. They're going to find all of your flaws, so it can be small. If you're looking for I'm thinking broader range things. If you want to get a pretty wide perspective, you can go bigger on, say, something like a survey, where you're not going to get as much. If you're looking for more qualitative information as opposed to quantitative, or if you're looking for more quantitative information as opposed to qualitative, I think also you determine what you're doing and who you're solving for, and that's how you know when to bring people in. Yeah, go ahead, Geri.
Oh no, that's okay. I was just gonna say that the recruitment and finding people is a process in and of itself. Like, we had done something that required us to talk to educators, and it was the summer. Turns out none of the educators wanted to talk to us because they were all off. So you have to think about who they are. I think you do need, incentives in many cases to get people engaged. It might be that, people are chomping at the bit to give you feedback. You just have to find where they might be. So who those users are. So you have to, talk to people in the business, understand who they are, like to your point, defining who they are, and then figuring out like who may have touch points with them so you can get in touch. So in many cases, just getting people can be a challenge too.
Yeah,
It's usually something we will ask people if you want, we really want to get feedback. Do you have access to 10 people that are using this or that will be your users? If not, then we might take a different approach. Like in the case of the educators, we weren't able to talk to all of them, so we moved to a survey method. And that worked better. We didn't get exactly what we were looking for, but we did get feedback. So it was just a different kind.
When you're looking for feedback from just a few people, is there anything you're doing to make sure that you're not getting a bias out of the random set of people who are volunteer types, who are going to show up?
That's such a good question.
That's such a good question. I will say that there are places you can go. Yeah, right. You don't want just the loudest voices, I suppose. There are definitely places that you can go through that can help you with recruiting. Mm-hmm. The other way is being a little scrappy about it and approaching it sideways. So if you can identify what your problem is and what you're trying to solve and who your users might be, if you can approach people, that's another way of doing it, recruiting from groups that might not be top of mind can also help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would probably have to be part of your strategy, especially if you need that broad of an audience. And I also think that what you're bringing up is just a really big problem in how we find and talk with people about this. So I don't know that we have the answer, but it's really, really something that we should be thinking about.
I do know that I volunteer for a lot of stuff like that because it teaches me, it helps me grow as a researcher. So I might not have super strong opinions about something, but I want to know which questions people are asking. So maybe you just hope there's more people like me out there.
And
yeah, I'm throwing out the numbers.
Well, it's funny that you say that. Like I was just recently, we're doing some exercises to define something that we're building internally, and I was having a discussion with an engineer who will probably be working on this coming up. Like, hey, this is where we're at. This is what we're doing. I'm showing him the Figma board, kind of like where all the brainstorming is going, and we were talking about people who use this. In this case, it's like a networking app. And he's like, my cousin would be perfect. And he said he does this stuff all the time. And I'm like, oh, really? What does he do? And he's like, oh, he teaches Chinese. He's a Chinese tutor. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, I would have never in a billion years put together, like, that's how I would find someone. But now we will probably, talk to this person in addition to someone who's like, job it is to network with people all day. That in the traditional sense, right? Like some person in like a director position whose job it is to network. So sometimes it can be a little bit, you have to be a little scrappy and ask lots of questions, and it just kind of happens. And I know, again, that's not the best answer, but it
get
is
your
something.
team members to help recruit too.
Yeah, I mean, that is a thing. So, yes. Yeah.
I think, we are 1 minute over time. I
Okay.
think. So thank
Thank
you all so
you.
much. Appreciate your participation.